Two men, one dark desire, the urge to kill. Between them, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng murdered at least 11 people until a complete coincidence led to their capture. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for joining today. How are you? Hope you're doing well. Me, thanks for asking. I'm doing okay, aside from the fact that I've been trying to get the words out of my head that are in a song, but aren't song lyrics. I know that sounds strange, so I'm just going to tell you what it is, and I hope that you don't judge me too harshly. It's understandable if you judge me a little bit, but all day, in my head, I've been saying this one thing, and a couple of times out loud, but Cash Money Records taking over for the 9-9 in the 2000. All day, I don't know what the deal is, but hopefully saying it out loud a couple of times will get rid of it. So I've heard that's a trick that you can do. If you've got song lyrics stuck in your head, you just do the whole song, sing the whole song, and then it'll go away. Hey, I'm super pumped that you've decided to listen to 10-Minute Murder today. And before we get going with your story, this is your reminder to subscribe. If you are new to this podcast, you'll always be able to find the show and never miss an episode if you become a subscriber. Also, connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. If you have friends that like true crime stories, please let them know about this podcast. Links are in the show notes of this episode, as well as at 10minutemurder.com. Now to the story. Most serial killers follow some kind of pattern. Ted Bundy's victims were all women who looked very similar. Jack the Ripper targeted sex workers, and Jeffrey Dahmer preyed on black men. Nothing's more terrifying than a killer who doesn't follow any kind of pattern, killing any victim they can manage to subdue or abduct without planning or attempts to avoid investigation. In these cases, there's no way to feel safe. Anyone, literally anyone, is at risk, no matter the age, the gender, or the race. Well, I guess there is one thing more terrifying than a killer that murders without discrimination. Two of those killers, both cold-blooded sociopaths, working together. It's mind-boggling to imagine how one person could descend into the madness of serial killing, let alone how two sociopaths can meet each other and descend into a life of crime together. In the case of Charles Ng and Leonard Lake, two volatile and angry men came together and brutally ended the lives of 11 people, but they were rumored to have had up to 25 victims. Their lack of preference for who they killed might set Charles and Leonard apart from a lot of other serial killer profiles, but in some ways, they do fit the mold. In serial killer cases, the killers often have a difficult or traumatic past that led them to a life of crime. Charles and Leonard both followed this pattern, but in very different ways. One half of the pair, Charles, had a difficult childhood. He was physically abused by his dad, got expelled from a string of schools for his behavior, and ended up being arrested for stealing as a teenager. Although Charles didn't meet his future accomplice until adulthood, Leonard Lake's childhood also showed signs of the man he would become. But unlike Charles's traumatic childhood, Leonard's early years were already full of the desire to hunt and control others. As a young boy, he was encouraged by his grandmother to take naked photographs of his sisters, and he soon developed an obsession with violent pornography. He was a smart kid, but he spent his spare time catching wild mice and dissolving them, still alive, in chemicals. As Leonard grew, so did his fascination with violent sexual acts. His first marriage crumbled after his wife found out that he was not only viewing sadomasochistic BDSM pornography, but he was also creating it and starring in it. While Leonard was falling deeper into obsession with darker and more violent pornography, Charles was doing the same with his own bad habit, stealing. After he used false documents to join the Marines, he was caught in the act of stealing guns from the armory less than a year into his service. Leonard escaped after being arrested by the military police and fled to California. Then the two men met and began to fuel each other's madness. Both were obsessed with the idea of the nuclear apocalypse and Leonard had already constructed a survival bunker where he could live during the end of the world. Leonard briefly got arrested for his enormous stockpile of explosive devices and illegal firearms, and when authorities raided the property, they found Charles, who they sent back to the Marines. Both men were quickly released, Charles after he pled guilty, and Leonard after his bond was paid. At this point, it's suspected that Leonard was already a murderer, having killed his brother as well as a friend, Charles Gunner, whose identity he stole. Now, both Leonard and Charles were paranoid about being arrested, and they moved to an isolated cabin together. Leonard built a torture chamber, which he called a dungeon. With nobody around to stop them, the killing began. They didn't discriminate. Most serial killers have a type, but not these guys. It didn't matter if the victims were men or women, and it didn't matter if they were children. They even murdered people they knew, several of Charles's co-workers and the family who lived next door. The only clear pattern that emerged was that the duo had a preference for female victims, who they tortured and assaulted for days, whereas they were quicker to kill male victims and children. Maybe the craziest thing about Charles Ng and Leonard Lake is that despite killing people they knew, a risk that most serial killers avoided taking, they were caught because of nothing more than a random coincidence. Charles had continued his shoplifting habit, and he was caught attempting to steal a vise from a hardware store. He managed to run from the store on foot, but Leonard wasn't able to escape. When police asked to see Leonard's identification, they noticed something strange about the driver's license that he gave them. He was using a driver's license of someone who looked completely different, and police were suspicious immediately. But then they saw the name on the license. It belonged to Robin Scott Stapley, a man who had gone missing weeks before. When they searched Lake's car, they found an illegal silencer fitted on the gun and arrested him. Before he could be brought to justice, Leonard did what he said he would always do if he got caught. He took a smuggled cyanide pill and died in custody. As soon as Leonard showed the cops a driver's license belonging to a missing man, he had sealed Charles's fate. And when he revealed his real identity in jail, the hunt for Charles Ng began. Unlike Leonard, Charles didn't try to avoid jail with suicide. Instead, he fled to Canada. Despite successfully fleeing the country, he didn't manage to resist his deep-seated urge to shoplift. When he was caught stealing from a department store, Charles resisted arrest and ended up shooting a security guard in the struggle. Once again, Charles was in custody, and during the time he spent in Canadian prison, American authorities were uncovering the true depths of crimes the two men had committed together. The more investigators searched the cabin and its surrounding property, the more evidence they uncovered. And although they didn't yet know who all the victims were, the death toll continued to grow. Buried near the dungeon where Leonard and Charles liked to torture their victims, there was an enormous pile of human bones that had been crushed and burned beyond recognition. It weighed 40 pounds. At bare minimum, that's 11 human skeletons. In reality, it was likely even more. So who were the victims? Charles and Leonard liked to steal from the people they killed, and so many of the items they owned, especially cars, were able to be used to identify them. A Honda belonging to a missing man named Paul Cosner, a truck and a gun both belonging to Robin Scott Stapley, the man whose driver's license had gotten them caught, a license plate registered to Lonnie Bond, a friend of Stapley's, and the biggest find of all, a childish treasure map drawn by the men showing where they had buried 2 large buckets in the yard. The first bucket was full of envelopes containing information and names of victims. If the contents of the first bucket were able to be believed, then Charles and Leonard's real number of victims isn't 11, it's at least 25. The second bucket was key in helping investigators to confirm the identities of victims, as well as a timeline of the crimes Charles and Leonard committed together. It's full of journals where Leonard had documented his life and crimes, as well as videotapes of Leonard and Charles torturing 3 women. The victims on the tapes were able to be identified as Deborah Dubbs, who had gone missing along with her husband and baby son in 1984, Brenda O'Connor, who was the girlfriend of another victim, Lonnie Bond, and a missing woman named Kathy Allen. None of the women on the tape survived, with some of the injuries inflicted on video making authorities certain that the wounds would have been fatal. There are many reasons why the crimes of Charles and Leonard are so terrifying, But for many people, the main reason is that there is no logic or pattern to follow. They chose risky victims, made very little effort to avoid getting caught, and they were still able to get away with torturing and murdering as many as 25 men, women, and children. To this day, Charles Ng is still on death row, but Leonard Lake escaped justice, and for the families of the unnamed and unconfirmed victims of the serial killer duo, there are still no answers.